Hello and welcome back to What's Millie Making, where I'm Millie and this is a space where I talk about the past, present, and future of my making, mostly knitting. Today's video is going to be 6 different vintage patterns that I'd like to knit for Rhinebeck. I need help picking one because obviously I cannot knit 6 sweaters in 2 months. So one thing about me is that I am very prone to a Ravelry rabbit hole. How some people can fall down a rabbit hole on Pinterest, which to be fair I can too, but I'm more prone to a Ravelry rabbit hole, and every few months I basically start obsessing over vintage patterns and I go on eBay and used bookstore websites, thrift books, and scour the used market for old out of print patterns, books, Rowan magazines, all that jazz. However, I've never actually gotten around to knitting any of the patterns. I just admire them and then purchase a pattern and then don't make any of them. And what better time is there to knit an interesting sweater than for Rhinebeck, aka New York Sheep and Wool. And now technically I do have a Rhinebeck sweater which I'm knitting, which is the frame sweater by Andrea Mary, but sometimes I cannot resist the not like other girls syndrome. What can I say? I'm a millennial. I grew up on Twilight. Best to let this feeling out in the most harmless and useless and pointless situations like knitting a sweater. There's some dualities here because on one hand I really enjoy the community aspect of knitting the same sweater as everyone, but then on the other half there's a part of me that's I just want something that's mine, that I am making. I mean, and anybody else is welcome to make the same pattern as me, but I feel like I have some ownership because I'm picking the pattern versus another pattern that I'm making because other people are making. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Okay, so here are my rules or guidelines for picking a pattern. Number 1, I want it to be a colorwork pattern because I want it to be a challenge. Number 2, I have to be able to feasibly knit it within 2 months. So it has to be a challenge, but not so challenging that I could not, even if I was just maximizing my knitting time, there's no way I would get it done, which rules out my all-time favorite vintage pattern that I really want to knit one day, which is the Henri in Pennsylvania sweater. But that sweater just is it has so much intarsia. It has 10 color changes per row. It's just not happening within 2 months. So that rules that pattern out. Rule number 3 is the pattern has to be at least 10 years old. So technically I think something is considered vintage if it's more than 20 years old, but there are some late 2000s knitting patterns that I think very much fit the vintage aesthetic, especially because I don't necessarily think knitting patterns always what's trending in knitting patterns lines up with what's trending in the general public. Rule number 4 is I must be able to get my hands on it in a reasonable manner. I must be able to get my hands on the pattern in a reasonable way. Either some of the patterns are still available for sale, like a digital pattern on Ravelry. Some of them I already have. Some of them are from books that there's a lot of them available on eBay or thrift books. So that also rules out some of the patterns from the earliest Rowan pattern books, which I absolutely love, but they're really hard to get, and I really don't want to buy a $50 vintage knitting pattern, especially when you see that it literally says it was £3 when it was first sold. It was £3 and I'm going to pay $50? I don't think so. Okay, and then my last rule is I must be able to knit it with at least 50% stash yarn. Most of the patterns I picked, I could knit it with all stash yarn, but I'm kind of giving myself some leeway as this is kind of a special occasion sweater. But I have found that over the past year, as I've been prioritizing knitting with stash yarn, I do feel it forces me to come up with more interesting color combinations that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of if I was buying all new yarn, but I still want to give myself that leeway. Okay, so without further ado, let us get into the patterns. So pattern number 1 is the Brocade pattern by Fassett. I don't know if that's the correct way to pronounce his name, but If you know who he is, you know who he is. Iconic designer. If you watch my 2024 Make 9, you might remember this pattern. So initially the plan was to knit this with different shades of unspun wool and give it kind of like a subtly marled effect. And the color palette was very much inspired by a painting that I saw at, which museum did I see it at? At the Frick. And obviously I tried to sit on the side today, so the original color palette was very much inspired by this painting of a Renaissance woman that I saw at the Frick. Alas, I am ditching that yarn combo because it's just not feasible for this time of year. My hands get clammy when I'm knitting with it when it's hot, and it leads the yarn to constantly break. But I still really want to get like color palette inspiration from Renaissance paintings, and I have been blessed to be able to go to many museums this summer, and I always love looking at the portraiture. And one thing I noticed in a lot of like the Renaissance women's portraits is their clothing, or like Renaissance, early medieval, the clothing tends to be either like quite monochrome or one color anchored with like a white, black, gold. Basically, I feel like the luxuriousness or like the richness of their clothes comes from different textures or patterns rather than use of like a lot of color or like a lot of contrast. Does that make sense? I keep saying does that make sense, but hopefully it makes sense. And naturally, because this pattern is named Brocade, I was looking at Brocade fabric too, which also led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole on like the history of 16th century Italian textiles, as well as like the difference between jacquard, damask, and brocade, and I'm probably definitely using them all interchangeably incorrectly, so apologies for that. Which also kind of then tumbled into reading about like the impact of imperialism and the Industrial Revolution on textile production, which is unrelated to this video. All that to say, I think I want to use a monochromatic color palette in this pattern and then have like a difference in textures to add interest to the pattern, inspired by how Renaissance brocade fabrics are interpreted in paintings. Is that overly convoluted? Possibly. I would like to knit this in purple. Purple is a color for royalty, so kind of fits that vibe, even though Italian Renaissance is not really royalty, it's more nobility. Let's get to the yarns. So for option number 1, I would use this Moondrake Cormo Sport in this purpley color, and then pair it with this Noro Silk Garden Solo color, which is like a tweedy color. My only reason I'm unsure about this color combination is because the Noro is quite cool toned and this Moondrake is quite warm toned, so would they jive together or would it look off? Who knows until I swatch. I do have one other purple in my stash that I think could work. It's this Barocco yarn that I bought during this year's New Jersey Wool Walk. I only have one ball of it. I would need to buy a second ball, but it's quite affordable, so I'm not worried about that. And I think honestly it could work with either of the other purples that I picked out. This one actually also has some depth of color to it. It looks like a really dark purple, but up close there's actually like hints of red, and it looks really interesting in my opinion. So that is my first sweater option, brocade sweater by Kaffe Fassett in some combination of purples. The next vintage pattern possibility is kind of like in a similar vibe. It's also inspired by the Renaissance. It is the Florentino pattern by Martin Storey, and whereas the previous pattern kind of reminds me of like Renaissance clothing fabrics, this one very much reminds me of like Renaissance tapestries. I think because maybe there's more of a mixture of motifs and the way that the color blocking works. It also does remind me of patterns that I would see on Indian sharis or like Indian art, which I love. And I think like Renaissance people were also inspired by Asian textiles. This pattern is actually from Rowan edition 44, which you can find some used copies of, but I actually found that somebody scanned the whole magazine on archive.org, so you can access it for free. I will include a link below. This edition actually has so many beautiful patterns, and they have a whole section called Renaissance, and I love like the styling and the photography of this whole series. And I mean, Florence, heart of the Renaissance. It's kind of like all perfect. Also, I just recently finished reading a book that takes place in Tuscany, and I don't know, maybe that's just like the vibe I'm in, which attracted me to this pattern. Okay, so for this pattern, there are actually quite a number of people on Ravelry who have made this project. I think there's like over 40 project pages, and I really love the color combinations that people have come up with. There are a lot of blue projects, and I really like this one where they use like a mixture of different blues and then they add in a dark tan. Looks so good. And there's another version where there's like a mixture of turquoises paired with a green. One of the more recent project pages on this pattern uses a green, a brown, and a cream, and something about this color palette just feels like very modern to me. If I were to pick this pattern, I do think I would get rid of the heavy like turtle. It's not even a turtleneck because I love a turtleneck. It's like a cowl neck or something. I don't know. It's a really, really big neckline that I just don't think I would enjoy. And I think that's the most like quote unquote dated aspect of the sweater. Some people might say it's like the most interesting design aspect, but it's just not for me. So if I were to knit it, I would remove that, and I think I would stick to a 2-color palette. So I have this Woolly Mammoth Fibers yarn that I got in a D-stash from Mega of Skeins of Dreams, and I started knitting the Melange sweater by Petite Knit in it before realizing that it was just going to be too cropped with the amount of yarn I have, so I'm frogging that project. So I have this yarn that I was just thinking could go into a colorwork project, and I think the color totally worked for this project. And if I were to do a 2-color version, I would pair it with just like a simple cream. And what I think I would do is I would basically invert what the main color and the contrast colors are in the like each section. So instead of like color blocking it with 3 colors, it would only be 2 colors. Does that make sense? So like one motif would have the white as a background and then the green as the contrast color, and then the other motif would have the green as a background and the white as a contrast color. And this sweater is actually constructed very unusually. You knit it flat, so that will take some time, but it is a larger gauge. So you knit it flat, like body up, and then you increase for the sleeves, and then like you cast on stitches for the neck, and then you continue knitting down the shoulders. I don't know. It's like a very interesting construction that I have not seen or knit before, but that adds interest to this pattern. Another colorway option that I was thinking for this sweater was if I would use this green again, and then I would get like a darker green in Cascade 220 to kind of follow like that monochrome vibe that I was thinking for the Brocade sweater. And there's just so many different options of Cascade 220 that could work for this. And then actually, when I was pulling yarn to make this video, I came up with this color combination, which also kind of eats. It's the green with the dark purple that I was thinking of for the Brocade sweater. The next sweater up for contention, up for possibility of knitting, is the Sapporo 1972 sweater by Dale, Norway. And you may know that name if you follow Handmade by Florence, either here on YouTube or on Instagram, because she has been knitting some of their patterns, and she actually started a knit along for them. So these are patterns that the brand releases for the Norwegian Olympic team every Winter Olympics, and they're just like really, really stunning. I think the most famous pattern is the Lillehammer. I don't know how to pronounce it, and I don't have the spelling in front of me. That sweater pattern. But while I was looking through all the patterns for the knit along, because you can knit basically any of the Olympic sweaters, it doesn't have to be that specific one, I found this one from 1972, but I feel like something about this pattern just looks very, very modern to me, especially because if I were to knit it, I would definitely knit it much, much shorter, kind of so it hits me above my hips. And I feel like the crew neck sweater cardigans are like very, very of the moment, and I really, really like the ones from, I think it's the brand is like, their Instagram handle is like, oh my god, Nikki. Anyhow, so I really, really like that silhouette right now, and I just finished my cardigan number 9, which has the same silhouette, and I'm really enjoying it. For colors for this sweater, so this is another one where there are a few projects on Ravelry. I think there's like 9 or 10, and I really love the ones that are white and red. It feels classic but also modern at the same time. However, I just don't have anything like that in my stash that could work. Come back to that color combo if I feel like knitting it. But for this sweater, I have been thinking of knitting it with one of my favorite colors of the moment, and just like a general color of the moment, which I guess you could call rat green, technically a chartreusey green. I would knit it. The main color is the Moondrake Cormo in this chartreusey green, and then for my contrast color I would use the cream Tugul DK. I don't know, I really like how this color combination is looking. It feels fun, modern, fresh. I don't know what other generic adjectives I could use. Then I was thinking of a slightly more extra combination, but I don't know if it would be too much. So I would replace that cream with this tweedy Noro yarn, so it would just like add an extra element of texture to the sweater. Is it too extra? Is it just extra enough? I won't know until I swatch, to be honest, to be fair. This yarn combination has just been on my mind for like the past month. Oh, this pattern is also pretty readily available, as there are a ton of scans of it online, and if you go to Handmade by Florence's YouTube or her Instagram, I'm not sure where she links it, but there's like a Discord channel that she created for the knit along, and people shared links for where you can find all the patterns. The next sweater pattern is actually 2 sweater patterns, and I would kind of combine them, or I guess maybe just pick one. It is the Orkney cardigan by Marie Wallin or the Maple cardigan by Marie Wallin. So the Orkney cardigan uses like very traditional Fair Isle motifs, and it is steeped, whereas the Maple cardigan uses intarsia, as I guess the patterns are a little bit less regular in terms of like chart repeats. However, I do think if I were to knit this, I would probably just do it stranded color work and try using letterback jacquard. The reason why I really like this pattern is, first of all, I feel like Fair Isle is definitely back. Not that it really ever goes anywhere, because it's just kind of like a classic design, but when I mean it's back, I mean I've just been seeing it everywhere. Like if I can go to the mall and find it, I'm going to consider it to be back, because that's not always the case. I've been seeing it from brands like Loewe. Oh my god, their Fair Isle this season has been so good, and it's just made me even more determined to knit a Fair Isle project. The real reason why I want to knit this is because there's one very specific sweater design that has basically been living rent-free in my mind since I first saw it like a year or 2 ago. It is this sweater by Molly Goddard. So the sweater actually came in a pullover, a vest, and a cardigan version. I personally really like the cardigan and pullover versions because you have that Fair Isle all over the body, but then the sleeves are striped with the same colors that are used in the body, similar to what Marie Wallin does in the Maple sweater, and I just love this design. I am determined to make a sweater like this. As for the color palette, I actually really love the color palette they used in their original design, the Molly Goddard sweater. And it's not necessarily something I would come up with, but I love the way it looks. If I were to use yarn from stash, I don't think I'd be able to replicate it perfectly because I don't really have much gray and black yarn. However, I bought quite a bit of non-superwash fingering weight wool when I was traveling for this sort of project, and I just already had some in stash because I'm always telling myself I'm going to knit a Fair Isle project, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. So I think if I were to knit this, my color scheme would be inspired by the Molly Goddard project with like yellows and pinks and reds and creams, but instead of like a gray and a black, I think I would use darker shades of brown. I'm like pretty sure I would be able to knit this with whatever I had in stash. Maybe I would have to buy a skein or 2 of brown, but that is it. Both of these patterns are available on Ravelry, plus the Orkney pattern is in this Rowan pattern book that I bought, which is very easily found on eBay and has a ton of great patterns. And if I were to knit this one, I'm not sure if I would stick with the more traditional motifs of the Orkney sweater or the more like floral motifs from the Maple sweater, but either way, whichever one I chose for the body, I would 100% do the striped sleeves. I I'm about to say I'm absolutely obsessed with the next sweater pattern, but I'm kind of like absolutely obsessed with every single pattern in this video. The next pattern is The Drummer by Annabel Fox. And this pattern is just so cool in my mind because I feel like the two stitch patterns that are used are like very opposite and not really something I would think of pairing together, or not really something I would see in like a ready wear design, but because they're knit with the same color palette, I just think they look really good together. So the cardigan on the front, it has a tartan print, and I just went to Scotland earlier this summer, so tartan has definitely been on my mind. And then on the back there is kind of like a southwest design, or reminds you of like the, what's it, kilim style rugs, that sort of motif. And that's not like, those are not two patterns you usually see together, but I think they just totally work in this cardigan pattern. As far as color options go, I really feel like this is a pattern that would work with so many different color options, because both of the designs that it kind of references comes in such a wide variety of colors. So when I was in Scotland, there was this one brand, Loch Erin, that I saw a lot of, and we actually did end up visiting their like weaving store after we left the Isle of Skye, where they have like every single tartan print that you could think of, and they have like all the names of it, which is really cool. Like they'll say like clan this, clan that, or like Stuart Royal this, Stuart Royal that. And you can buy fabrics, you can buy scarves, you can buy sweaters. They had a lot of Farrell sweaters there. Anyways, aside from that tangent, you can go on their website and you can buy all that stuff, but it's also just great for inspiration. So if I were to knit this, I was definitely leaning towards more of like a traditional tartan color palette. I really like the ones that are like blues and greens and then with pops of like red and yellow. However, I didn't really have yarn like that in my stash, so I was looking at maybe something a little bit more modern, and I came up with this color palette, which I honestly really love. For my main color, I would use like this dark chocolatey brown. I don't know if I would specifically use this yarn that I have in stash, which is this hand-dyed yarn from Coast to Coast Yarn Co., because I think this would actually kind of shine in a plain stockinette sweater. But just to get like an idea of the color, I'm going to be showing this. And then for my contrast colors, because of the way like this sweater is designed, I think you could honestly use as like many contrast colors as you want. And I don't know the exact yardages for this pattern because it is in a pattern book that I do not have, but it is very readily available. So if I choose to knit this one, I'm just going to buy the pattern book on Thrift Books. Back to my color palette. So I would use the dark brown as the main color, and then for my contrast colors, I think I would like to use colors from Playful Days Yarns Hydrangea collection, which I bought a ton of to make my stripe hype sweater, which I will be frogging because I don't like the way that it turned out, but I still really love the color. So it would be like purples, cream, and then I have some like hot pink and a lighter pink of this Sand & Scorn Double Sunday that I bought to pair with the hydrangea colorways. I just feel like that would look so good. And then maybe I would also add in like a sky blue. There's just something about this color palette that just really hits for me. Okay, and then I just had to squeeze in one last sweater, which is another sweater by Annabel Fox. It is the Tutti Frutti sweater. Now there's a good chance, there's like a 99% chance that I will not be picking this pattern because it is all over intarsia. That kind of nixes it for me because that is just a little bit more time and labor intensive than stranded knitting. But I had to include this pattern because I think it's just so fun. Like on one hand, it feels very 80s, which is when it came out, but it also feels very like 2000s, but it also feels very modern because I feel like fruit motifs are just timeless, which feels weird to say, but like you'll literally always find stuff with fruit. Like, I just feel like fruit was always cute, and I think if I were to knit this pattern, I would also use like a cream or off-white background color, and then I would knit the fruits all in kind of like classic like colors you would find the fruits in, but like pastel shade, you know? This pattern is also in a vintage Rowan pattern book, but it's another one that is pretty readily available. I saw multiple copies on sale on the various used bookstores online, various used book sites Yes, that is what I mean to say. Those are the 6 patterns that I have picked to possibly knit for Rhinebeck, but I need help picking one. Going into the making this video, I thought that I would definitely be making the brocade sweater, but then as I was like typing up my notes and pulling out the yarn and recording the video, I feel like I'm kind of more tempted by the tartan one. I don't remember the names off the top of my head. I'm kind of more tempted by the Drummer by Annabel Fox, as well as the Maple / Orkney sweaters by Wallin. So those are the 3 tied for first place. So I'm sure if you've made it this far into the video, you do have opinions. Please do share. If you were me, which pattern would you knit? And if I gave like multiple color options, which color option do you think is the best? Whatever pattern I do end up knitting, I'm so excited to knit my first vintage sweater pattern, and I will hopefully create like a knitting vlog all about it. I think for today that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you are knitting or making something while watching this video, please do share it in the comments, because I'm nosy and I love to know what is on other people's needles. Hence why I consume a lot of knitting podcast content. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like and follow along. I think the next video will be something surrounding my fall knitting / sewing plans, or it might be like that mood board video that I talked about in my previous knitting podcast. Okay, so I think I'm really done talking for now. So thanks again for watching, happy knitting, and hope to see you again next time. Bye!